a wife's delight in presenting her husband as her elegant maid. I had known about Roger's little secret for years, 12 to be exact. When I first stumbled across it, I won't pretend I handled it well. Seeing my husband in women's clothing caught me off guard, and at the time, it made me deeply uncomfortable. But life has a way of softening sharp edges. Over time, what once unsettled me became something I quietly accepted, something I chose not to dwell on. Roger, to his credit, was always respectful about it. Once he realized I didn't want to be involved, he kept that part of himself private. He only indulged when he was completely alone. There was one short-lived attempt to convince me otherwise. He once asked if he could sleep in a nightdress, but I made it clear that wasn't something I was comfortable with, and he never pushed again. Aside from that, he was a good husband, kind, dependable, and thoughtful. If I had one real frustration, it was the housework. Despite both of us working full-time, most of it somehow landed on me. I carried that quiet resentment for years until things changed. About a year ago, Roger's job took an unexpected turn. He narrowly avoided being laid off by agreeing to reduced hours, just 3 days a week and a smaller paycheck to match. He tried to make up the difference with consulting work, but it never quite took off. What he did gain, though, was time, more than he'd had in years. At first, he threw himself into projects around the house. He redecorated rooms, fixed things we'd been ignoring, cleaned up the garden, things I'd almost given up hoping would ever get done. But eventually, even those ran out. And with all that free time, it didn't take much imagination to guess how he filled some of it. That's when I decided something needed to shift. If he was home more, it only made sense that he'd take on more responsibility. Actually, not just more, most of it. And to his credit, he agreed. That's when Wednesdays quietly became his day. On his day off, he would slip into one of my old dresses. Nothing extravagant, just things I no longer wore, and spend the day cleaning, doing laundry, ironing, keeping everything in order. Strangely, it stopped feeling strange. In fact, it worked. The house was cleaner than it had ever been. The laundry was never piled up. Everything just ran more smoothly. My days felt lighter, less burdened. And somewhere along the way, my discomfort faded into something closer to indifference, maybe even quiet appreciation. One day, half joking, I told him, "My new housemate is doing an excellent job." The way he looked at me, half embarrassed, half relieved, stuck with me. There was something genuine in it. Gratitude, maybe. Or simply the comfort of being accepted, even in a small way. For months, it stayed our private arrangement. I hadn't told a soul. As far as I knew, no one else had the faintest idea. Until, of course, I let it slip. I was visiting my friend Betty one afternoon. She'd been a widow for years and made her living as a dressmaker. Betty had a gift. She could turn fabric into something beautiful without effort, from elegant gowns to tiny, intricate doll outfits. As we were chatting, I noticed one of her creations, a doll dressed in a delicate little maid's outfit, complete with apron and cap. It was charming, almost whimsical. Without thinking, I laughed and said, "Oh, Roger would love that." The moment the words left my mouth, I froze. Betty looked up, one eyebrow raised, curiosity flickering across her face. "What do you mean?" she asked. I didn't know Roger had an interest in dolls. I stumbled for a second trying to backtrack, but it was no use. The damage was done. After a brief, awkward pause, I sighed. Betty and I had known each other too long for me to pretend. So I told her, well, most of it. I explained Roger's new routine, how he handled the housework on his day off, jokingly calling himself my housemaid. To my surprise, Betty didn't react with shock or judgment. Instead, she smiled, almost amused. "Well," she said lightly, "I suppose you make him wear a dress and apron while he does it." She said it like a joke, giving me an easy out. I could have laughed, brushed it aside, and changed the subject. But something in her tone told me she already understood more than she was saying. So this time I didn't dodge it. I simply nodded. I told Betty that, oddly enough, the whole thing had been Roger's idea. When I pushed him to take responsibility for the housework, he'd shrugged and said if he was going to do what he called women's work, he might as well dress accordingly. "Really?" Betty smiled, clearly amused. "Oh, don't look so flustered. It's not as unusual as you think. There are plenty of men who enjoy stepping into that kind of role." Roger had said something similar once, but hearing it from someone else made it feel more real somehow. "How would you know that?" I was curious now. Betty didn't answer right away. She studied me for a moment as if deciding how much to reveal. Then she sighed softly and reached for the wine. "Well," she said, pouring us both a glass, "you've trusted me with your little secret. I suppose it's only fair I share one of mine." She leaned back, cradling her glass, and began telling me a story I never would have guessed. Years ago, before I had even met her, Betty had trained as a seamstress in a proper fashion house. She married young, but the marriage didn't last. During that time, she discovered a side of herself she hadn't fully understood before. Her attraction wasn't limited in the way she'd always assumed. When the relationship ended, she walked away with a modest settlement, just enough to give her a fresh start. With her skills and determination, she turned to what she knew best: sewing. She started small, taking local orders. Alterations, custom dresses, the occasional costume. Slowly but surely word spread. Her work spoke for itself. Her first big break came when a local drama group asked her to design costumes for a pantomime. The production was a success, and so were her designs. People noticed. Not long after, she received an unusual phone call. It was one of the young men from the drama group. He told her he admired her work and wanted to commission a costume for an upcoming fancy dress party. Betty agreed and invited him over to discuss it. When he arrived, she said he was strikingly good-looking but painfully shy. She tried to help him along, suggesting ideas. A pirate, a gladiator, something bold and theatrical. But nothing seemed to interest him. He just nodded awkwardly, avoiding eye contact. Finally, a bit impatient, she asked if he had something specific in mind. She laughed softly as she told me what happened next. The poor boy turned bright red, hesitated for what must have felt like forever, and then blurted it out. He wanted to go to the party dressed as a woman. Betty said she had to fight not to show her surprise. Instead, she kept her tone calm and reassuring. "Of course," she told him. "That's quite common at costume parties. Did you have a particular look in mind?" Another long pause. Then, almost in a whisper, he admitted he was thinking of a French-made outfit. This time she nearly lost her composure, but somehow managed to keep a straight face. Rather than laugh, she treated it like any other request, asking about details, fabrics, style. Then he showed her a photograph he'd brought along, a cheap, grainy magazine clipping. It featured a very frilly, rather revealing maid's uniform. The figure wearing it looked off, a bit too broad, too rigid. Beside them stood a stern woman, as if overseeing or instructing. At first, Betty assumed it was just a strong-featured woman in costume. Then it clicked. It wasn't a woman at all. The realization changed something for her. Instead of brushing it off, she leaned into the project. If he wanted a maid's outfit, she would make it extraordinary, beautiful, intricate, impossible to ignore. And since he made it clear money wasn't an issue, she poured herself into every detail. Over the next few weeks, he came by for fittings. Each visit followed the same pattern. Awkward greetings, quiet conversations, careful adjustments to the costume. He had to change in front of her so she could measure properly, and she began to notice something in his demeanor. He was nervous, yes, but there was excitement there too. A kind of anticipation he couldn't quite hide. And she admitted with a small smile, she found herself enjoying the process more than she expected. There was a subtle shift in the dynamic. She was the one in control, guiding, adjusting, deciding. He followed her lead completely. But as the costume neared completion, something started to feel off. Whenever she casually asked about the party, when it was, who would be there, he became evasive. His answers were vague, almost rehearsed, as though he didn't want to talk about it at all. That's when Betty's curiosity really kicked in. She did a little reading, a little quiet research of her own. And before long, she began to suspect that the fancy dress party wasn't the real reason behind his request at all. When it came time for the final fitting, Betty decided she'd had enough guessing. She gently pressed him for the truth. At first he dodged the question, but eventually the tension got to him. His voice shook and he admitted it. There was no party. There never had been. The outfit was simply for himself. Once that was out in the open, everything shifted. Betty said it actually made things easier. Clearer. She stepped fully into her role, calm and confident, and asked him to bring everything he intended to wear. Wig, shoes, stockings, all of it, so she could see the full picture. When he finally arrived dressed head to toe, she helped him with the finishing touches, adjusting his hair, refining the makeup, perfecting the details. And when she stepped back to look, even she was surprised. He looked convincing. The layers of petticoats gave the outfit shape and movement. The apron sat just right, and the lace details she'd carefully chosen elevated everything. It wasn't just a costume anymore. It was something far more polished than either of them had imagined at the start. She even had him pose for a few photographs, telling him she might use them to showcase her work. He agreed, shy but clearly pleased. Afterward, they sat down to settle payment. He began to reach for the money he'd brought, but Betty stopped him. Instead, she made him an offer. If he was willing to help her explore a new direction for her business, she'd let him keep the outfit, free of charge. Her idea was simple. First, he could point her toward magazines or communities where she might advertise to others who shared his interests. Second, she wanted permission to use the photos she'd taken. And third, she suggested he might occasionally help her by modeling or giving feedback on future designs. He looked surprised, almost stunned, but after a moment he agreed. Betty smiled as she told me that decision changed everything. What started as a one-off request quickly turned into something much bigger. There was, it turned out, a small but very dedicated market for custom-made outfits like his. And those clients? They were willing to pay well. Peter, as she introduced him, became a regular presence. Sometimes he modeled new designs, other times he simply offered opinions. Over time he grew more confident and their professional relationship settled into an easy, mutually beneficial rhythm. Then one day something even stranger happened. She received a phone call from a woman asking if Betty could make a maid's outfit, similar to the one she'd advertised for her daughter's husband. At first Betty thought it was a joke. But the woman sounded perfectly serious. Curious, she agreed to a meeting. When the appointment time came, 3 women arrived at her door. One, older and composed, clearly led the group. The other 2 were helping a 4th figure between them, a man bundled awkwardly in a coat and scarf, looking deeply uncomfortable. It didn't take long to realize he wasn't there by choice. The older woman calmly explained once they were alone. The man was her son-in-law, and in her opinion he had treated her daughter very poorly. She'd decided it was time he learned a lesson, and Betty's work had given her an idea. She wanted not one but several maid outfits made for him. Betty admitted she didn't quite know whether to laugh or be concerned, but curiosity won out. When she stepped into the lounge, the scene was almost surreal. The poor man was already being maneuvered into position for measurements, while his wife and her sister stood nearby, clearly enjoying the situation far more than he was. The mother-in-law, completely unfazed, gave her instructions like she was placing an ordinary order. 3 outfits, each distinct. 1 black, 1 pink, 1 yellow. All elaborate. All decorative. The price was high. They didn't hesitate. A few weeks later, Betty received a parcel. Inside were photographs, evidence of her work being put to use. The man, dressed in each of the outfits, was shown carrying out household chores. Along with them was a neatly written note thanking her and mentioning they had already recommended her services to someone else. By the time Betty finished her story, I didn't quite know what to think. Part of me was stunned. Another part, oddly reassured. She spoke about it all so casually, so matter-of-factly, that it made Roger's situation feel far less unusual than I'd once believed. We drifted on to other topics after that, lighter ones. But just as I was getting ready to leave, Betty circled back. "Carol," she said almost thoughtfully, "isn't Roger's birthday coming up?" I paused. "Yes. The 23rd. Why?" A slow, mischievous smile spread across her face. "Well," she said, "if he's been doing such a wonderful job as your little housemaid, perhaps he deserves something special." I already had a feeling where this was going. "How would you feel," she continued, "about me making him a proper maid's outfit?" I didn't answer right away. The thought alone made me hesitate. Roger would be mortified knowing Betty knew about his private habit, let alone that she was offering to design something just for him. But Betty waved it off lightly as if she'd already anticipated my concern. "It would just be a bit of harmless fun," she said. Betty went a step further than I expected. She insisted on making the outfit as a gift, simply because she wanted to see how it would turn out. Over the following weeks, she checked in now and then, asking about Roger's measurements, small details about his size and preferences, all while assuring me it would be ready just in time for his birthday. At one point, she even suggested she might drop by to see him wearing it. I wasn't entirely at ease with that idea, but Betty had a way of making things sound perfectly harmless. She brushed off my hesitation, saying Roger would probably enjoy the surprise more than he'd ever admit. When his birthday finally came, I stuck to our usual routine at first. Aftershave, a new shirt, and a good bottle of whiskey. Then, with a bit of nervous anticipation, I handed him the larger parcel. He opened it slowly. Inside was the outfit Betty had made. Black fabric neatly structured with a crisp white apron and matching cap. Fine lace traced the edges and a full underskirt gave it a striking shape. It was elegant, far more refined than anything he owned before. Roger stared at it for a long moment, his cheeks coloring slightly. "It's beautiful," he said quietly. Then he looked up at me, puzzled. "But how did you know? And where did this come from?" I hesitated, then admitted the truth. "Betty made it." His expression shifted instantly, surprise then realization. "You told Betty?" I quickly explained how it had slipped out by accident, how she hadn't judged, only wanted to do something kind. After a moment he exhaled, the tension easing just a little. In the end he admitted it was a thoughtful gesture. Later that afternoon, with a bit of gentle encouragement, he agreed to try it on. He went upstairs to get ready while I waited below, half curious, half anxious about how this would all unfold. And as if perfectly timed, Betty arrived. I called up to Roger, reassuring him it was just Betty, encouraging him to come down when he was ready. After a few minutes he appeared in the doorway. He looked nervous, but there was something else there too. A quiet pride. Betty's face lit up as she took him in, her gaze thoughtful and approving. "Very nice," she said warmly. "Though perhaps the makeup is a little heavy." Then she tilted her head slightly. "But tell me, what should we call you when you're dressed like this? Surely not Roger." He froze, clearly unprepared for that question. I haven't really thought about it," he admitted. Betty chuckled softly and turned to me. "Well, we can't have that. What do you think, Carol? Have you ever imagined a name?" I paused for a moment, then smiled. "Actually, yes. I've always thought of him as Rosie." "Rosie," Betty repeated, clearly pleased. "Perfect." She turned back to him with a playful spark in her eyes. "Well then, Rosie, it's lovely to meet you." Rosie blushed deeply, unsure how to respond. Betty clapped her hands lightly. "And as it happens, I've brought a little something extra." He looked immediately uneasy, but she carried on as if it were the most natural thing in the world, asking him to sit so she could take a proper look at the outfit beneath his robe. He hesitated, glancing at me for reassurance, clearly embarrassed. But Betty's tone remained gentle, encouraging rather than forceful. "There's no need to be shy," she said kindly. Slowly he complied, lifting the robe just enough to reveal the careful details underneath. The stockings, the shoes, he had clearly put effort into the whole look. Betty nodded appreciatively. "You've done this very well. It suits you." He flushed again, caught somewhere between embarrassment and quiet satisfaction. Then Betty reached into her bag and pulled out a small accessory, something decorative, playful, clearly designed to add a bit of theatrical charm to the outfit. Both of us looked at it, a little surprised. Betty only smiled, explaining it lightly as a fun addition, nothing serious, just something to complete the look. Roger seemed at a loss for words, his face bright red, and I realized I probably looked just as startled. I had known Betty for years, but this side of her, bold, mischievous, almost daring, was entirely new to me. Still, despite the initial shock, Roger didn't protest. Betty adjusted the final detail with care, then stepped back, hands on her hips, admiring the result with quiet satisfaction. "There," Betty said at last, stepping back with a satisfied look. "Now everything comes together." Roger, still flushed and clearly overwhelmed, finally found his voice. He let out a small breath and admitted the whole experience felt a bit unreal, like he'd somehow stepped into someone else's life. Betty only laughed softly. "Then treat it like that," she said reassuringly. "Think of it as a role. Just for today." With that, she guided him through the final steps of getting properly dressed. He slipped off the robe, revealing the corset and careful layers he had already put on. Over that, he added a simple black slip before Betty helped him into the petticoats she had made. They were stunning, layer upon layer of structured fabric and fine netting, spreading out gracefully from his waist. Each movement made them rustle faintly, giving the whole outfit a sense of life. Roger's reaction said everything. He turned slowly in front of the mirror, watching how the shape shifted and moved, clearly captivated. There was a quiet delight in his expression that he couldn't quite hide. Betty noticed it too and gave a small approving nod. All right, Rosie, she said. Time for the main piece. Without protest, he lifted his arms, letting her carefully lower the dress over his head. She guided his arms into the sleeves, smoothing the fabric into place before fastening it neatly at the back. With that final adjustment, the transformation felt complete. I had to admit, it suited him far better than I expected. Betty stepped in to tie the apron with practiced precision, then placed the delicate frilled cap gently on his head. Once finished, she took a step back and, with a playful flourish, presented him. There we are, she said, glancing at me with a smile. Your maid is ready. Roger's cheeks turned even redder, but when Betty encouraged him, he gave a small, hesitant curtsy, awkward but sincere. You look wonderful, Rosie, I said, meaning it. Betty has done an incredible job. He nodded, still studying his reflection, almost as if he were trying to take it all in. It really is beautifully made, he admitted softly. Almost too nice to actually work in. I couldn't help but smile. Oh, I'm sure we'll find something suitable, I teased. Betty laughed, folding her arms, clearly pleased with the result, and perhaps the entire situation. Well then, I continued lightly, since we now have such a capable maid, why don't we start with afternoon tea? Roger blinked, taking a second to understand. Then, with a small shift in posture, he seemed to settle into the moment. He gave another shy little curtsy. Yes, madam, he replied quietly. And with that, he turned and left the room to prepare it. Betty and I exchanged amused glances, both of us smiling as we watched him go, each of us, perhaps, realizing that what had once felt unusual had somehow become something unexpectedly natural.